Are you one of the 2.6 billion people affected worldwide by obesity? Abdominal fat can actually lead to an early death. And no, it is not just harmless fat. Every second German citizen is considered overweight. Or let me put it another way, around 50% of people in Germany weigh far too much. That's almost 42 million people. 42 million, that's an incredibly high number. Probably no one can really imagine the number. It's too big for our brain. And the vast majority of these people certainly perceive the fat deposits on their hips and buttocks as a flaw, and they don't like it. That's already bad enough. But a big belly is actually much, much more dangerous than what I just mentioned. This is anything but just some harmless fat. It is very unhealthy. It has a major impact on many other diseases, which in the worst case can lead to premature death. It would be best to avoid that. Abdominal fat has a very strong influence on our health. It has to be said clearly. And now we're going to find out and talk about what dangers are lurking behind big bellies. And we'll also find out how you can combat them with the right eating patterns and a few tricks from me. So stay tuned and watch the video. Hello, my name is Dr. Tobias Weigel. With my YouTube channel, I would like to make a contribution to providing medically understandable and correct information about diseases, causes, and topics such as exercise, sport, and nutrition, because these are closely related. If you don't want to miss anything, subscribe to my channel now. Yes, to be honest with you, the beer belly is unfortunately the worst belly we can have. No discussion. And that's why a saying like, this beer shaped this belly, is really garbage. It's actually not a good thing at all. It's not about any beauty ideals now. I'm not talking about being slim or about a six-pack, but simply about our own health and what is good for us. And the stomach here is especially important. This is where many bad hormones are coming from. These bad hormones have a strong influence on diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, and many more diseases. And that's also very important right now. It's like a vicious circle. Abdominal fat in particular has a strong influence on your feeling of hunger and satiety. Abdominal fat can also increase the likelihood of food cravings. There is a good thing about it too. It can certainly be said that in most cases, getting rid of this excess fat is essentially laying in your own hands. You can do it yourself. I'll explain how you can do this in just a moment. But first things first, we should try to understand why a beer belly is such a big risk for us in particular. Why is too much abdominal fat dangerous for you? Abdominal fat consists of two types of fat, subcutaneous and visceral fat. If our abdominal circumference increases, it is mainly because of the visceral fat, and therefore this is often used as a synonym. Don't be surprised, I'm going to do it like that too from now on. And it is precisely this visceral fat that is one of the most important culprits behind diseases. As I said, many diseases such as diabetes, such as high blood pressure, atherosclerosis, but also, for example, strokes can be caused by it. All of these can be the result of visceral fat, even dementia. All of these are associated with visceral fat. This study also emphasizes this. You should remember the following. The more visceral fat there is in the body, the more messenger substances are being produced, in particular bad messenger substances. And the risk of disease is also higher for you then. I'll tell you a bit more about why these particular messenger substances are problematic in just a moment. But please beware, the topic is actually not only important for overweight people. Even people who are thin on the outside can actually have too much visceral fat inside their body. This is possible. This is because visceral fat is deposited between the organs. It won't be as visible. It's not just about that beer belly, but it can also affect you when you're thin. However, it is usually the case that a lot of visceral fat is also visually visible. Keyword, beer belly. But it doesn't have to be that way. The keyword for this would be skinny fat. And why is this fat in particular so dangerous? The reason for this is because visceral fat is very metabolically active. It produces more than 200 messenger substances. I have included a selection of these here. We are talking about the largest glandular organ in the body after all, and the more abdominal fat we have, the larger this glandular organ becomes. Very likely this has something to do with evolution, as is often the case. Abdominal fat is supposed to provide energy quickly when food is scarce. That's the idea behind it, and it's not a bad idea at all. There is a possibility that it also serves a function for our immune system, and it may also serve as a barrier against pathogens. This does sound good at first. So why is visceral fat then considered so harmful for us? The main cause of these issues is probably the high hormonal activity of the visceral fat cells. They provide energy quickly. Of course, this was good. It was necessary in the past, thousands of years ago. But now this visceral fat, this abdominal fat, is basically useless. We don't have the same problems as we did 1,000 years ago, at least not in first world countries like Germany. The numerous messenger substances released by abdominal fat include those that affect blood pressure, among other things. Therefore, the risk of increased blood pressure can affect the release of the hormone insulin, hence the risk of diabetes. And abdominal fat can trigger inflammation, autoimmune diseases, and more, as this study also shows. A little side note, you should make sure that your meals are based primarily on good fats. So, in particular, I am talking about unsaturated fatty acids. They can somewhat reduce the disadvantages caused by the hormones that the abdominal fat releases and lessen their effects. It may sound contradictory at first, but yes, good fats help against a lot of abdominal fat. The more visceral fat is present, the more certain messenger substances are being produced. As I mentioned, an excess of these substances can have negative effects. That's the key message, and you should know this key message. This is one possible explanation for why abdominal fat promotes diseases such as high blood pressure and diabetes. Let's be honest for a moment, it's likely that no doctor has ever seen a healthy person with a fat belly, so to speak, at least if you look at the blood values. And a life-threatening heart attack or stroke can then be the result, and the probability of them happening is then greatly increased. Another fact about visceral fat. It also sends stress-related signals such as the stress hormone cortisol, the catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline, which regulate the breakdown of fat. They are released, and thus the so-called neutral fats and triglycerides are immediately produced. These triglycerides are discharged directly into the liver. The result at some point is a fatty liver. And triglycerides can also reduce sensitivity to insulin by storing fat in the muscles. All of this is bad news. This means that over some time, a so-called insulin resistance develops in the body. Again, a consequence of visceral fat. Dangerous consequences can then be diabetes, calcification of the blood vessels, fatty liver, and gout. So it's time to lose fat if you have too much. This leads us to the next point. When do we have too much abdominal fat? This is probably the most important question for you. When do I actually have too much abdominal fat? But even slim people, skinny fat, can have a lot of visceral fat. So that's something to keep in mind. When do we have too much abdominal fat? 3 measurements are important. First, waist circumference. Second, BMI. And third, body fat percentage. And let me put it in simple terms. The fatter you are, or the more abdominal fat you have on your body, the more you should focus on your BMI to get it under control. If your goal is a six-pack, that is very little fat in the body, then the body fat percentage plays an even greater role in this. But more on that later. The main measure of visceral fat is the waist circumference, which is quite specific. This circumference is measured in the middle between the lower rib cage and the upper edge of the hip bone and is a good indicator. Women with a waist circumference over 80 centimeters are at increased risk of cardiovascular diseases such as heart attacks, strokes, type 2 diabetes, etc. For men, it's over 94 centimeters. You can check it out for yourself. We have these typical industrial diseases and the typical reasons, such as heart attacks and strokes, from which many of us die these days. You can check on your risk yourself, so to speak, with the waist circumference. And now to the next measurement, the body mass index, or BMI. On its own, it provides information about body mass, but not about the presence of abdominal fat. Keyword here, for example, if you have a lot of muscle mass, it is a fact that even people with normal weight, or in other words, a normal BMI, can be affected by the effects of visceral obesity. I've just said that already. This is very, very often forgotten, and then you can hear people say, I don't actually weigh that much in the end. While this is true and important, the number on the scale is not everything. There is more to look at. It depends on where the fat is located, and depending on that, you should try to get rid of that fat. So look out for things like a big, flabby stomach, but with thin legs. That's also not good. How to easily lose abdominal fat? The good thing about abdominal fat is that if we want, we can get rid of it relatively quickly again. And this is great news. Since this area is so metabolically active, the body breaks down this fat first when it is in need of additional energy. But be aware of one thing. This does not mean that you can specifically train off belly fat, as is sometimes said on the internet. There are no specific exercises for abdominal fat. Through enough physical activity, a man can reduce 80 to 120 grams of visceral fat per week. That is what's feasible on average, so to speak. This corresponds to around 1 centimeter less in waist circumference. And every centimeter, every kilogram counts for your health. If you lose only 5 kilograms, your risk of getting diabetes decreases by around 50 to 60%. The risk of cardiovascular diseases decreases by a good 30%. That is almost a third. And you should always bear this in mind. Every little bit helps already. And you may already have guessed it. There are 2 major methods for losing abdominal fat. More exercise and better nutrition. That means from now on, you should include plenty of filling foods in your diet. So foods should be high in protein and high in fiber. So, try to choose a protein-rich diet pattern, which means above all, you should eat foods that are high in protein. Ideally, you should aim for around 1.4 to 1.5 grams, 1.6 grams, maximum 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Proteins satiate for a long time, nourish the muscles well, and contribute to a good body shape. And good body shape means exactly that, having more muscle, so to speak, more muscles, less fat. Because in order to lose fat, we have to eat in such a way that we consume more energy, for example by exercising, than we supply to the body from the outside. That's the calories in, calories out principle after all. A low-calorie eating pattern is therefore also very important here. And ideally, we should aim for a calorie deficit of around 500 kilocalories per day. No more than that. Stay away from crash diets. Why? They don't do anything because of the yo-yo effect. When changing eating patterns, it is about sustainable weight loss. This is important. And if we do this, this is exactly where our muscles support us. How do they do that? The reason is that our muscles can be considered an expensive luxury good for our bodies, which is one of the first things our body can no longer afford when there is a lack of energy. And that's why we also lose some of our muscle mass in the period where we want to lose weight, lose abdominal fat. Protein, regular training, and exercise can protect us from this. We want to lose fat, abdominal fat, but we don't want to have less muscle. That is important, and therefore the second building block alongside nutrition is training. And in that, there are two different ways for you to train. Firstly, endurance training, and secondly, something that works very well, muscle building, HIIT training. Targeted strengthening of the core muscles, especially the abdominal and back muscles, is something particularly important. It is also important to emphasize at this point that whether you see your abdominal muscles has nothing to do with how you are training. So whether you do a lot of crunches, for example, this is secondary. The main thing this depends on is your body fat percentage. Even untrained people have abdominal muscles. The less abdominal fat you have, the higher the likelihood of seeing your muscle underneath. In other words, you can do a lot of abdominal exercises and have really nice abdominal muscles, but as long as the fat is on top, you can't see it. In general, and this is also important to me and the reason I recommend strength training, the more muscles we have, the higher the basal metabolic rate and the less fat we have. It's a very simple calculation. The crucial things to lose weight are protein and regular training, endurance training, and strength training. And in order not to give you false hopes, you should also note that targeted reduction of, for example, only abdominal fat is something that's not possible. I want to emphasize this again because you find this so often on the internet. We can only lose body fat overall, not in specific areas. But you are able to lose abdominal fat relatively quickly because it is so metabolically active. Tips against abdominal fat. Now I will give you some solid tips to achieve that. Tip 1 hopefully won't be a surprise. You should avoid soft drinks, all that sweet stuff, and abstain from alcohol. These are all high in calories and will make any weight loss goal unachievable. As soon as we provide our body with the energy sources readily available in sweet drinks or alcohol, our body immediately stops breaking down fat because it is much more time-consuming to break down fat. And to then tap into our emergency reserves, that is not going to happen. The exact opposite will happen. Excess calories, especially from alcohol, especially from this sweet stuff, are then converted into new fat reserves and stored for bad times. Keyword beer belly. And the beer belly develops. Another aspect, the breakdown of alcohol, and you should know that as well, has a high priority for your body or for our body because the body recognizes alcohol for exactly what it is, namely poison. Alcohol is poison. This means that the poison is being broken down by the liver as quickly as possible. That's good, that's important. However, while that happens, the fat storage increases even more. The liver thus deals with the breakdown of alcohol and accumulates fat during this time, so to speak. To make matters worse, we drink alcohol mainly in the evening. And by doing that, we will negate the most important interval of fat burning, namely the night. This is also a very important aspect. While we normally burn fat at night, our body now has to break down the alcohol during that period and is busy doing so. And as if that's not enough, there's another problem that also occurs predominantly after drinking alcohol. As this interesting study shows, we tend to reach for some food to fill the belly even more after a glass or two of alcohol. The feeling of hunger is basically woken up again. Unfortunately, the bad news when it comes to alcohol does not end there. Normally, calorie-dense foods such as alcohol or sweets should suppress our appetite at least for a certain period of time. This is what calorie-dense foods and drinks usually do. Alcohol, however, has the exact opposite effect. The reason for this is that alcohol activates so-called AGRP neurons, which are normally only activated when starvation is imminent. Sounds paradoxical, right? The consequence is that, as I said, we reach for the buffet, and many of you may know that feeling when you had a nice drink and now you want to go out for a kebab at the end of the night. Tip number 2, in addition to proteins, as I had already said before, dietary fiber is also very important. These are also really filling. This is mainly due to the fact that it contains a lot of fiber, so it has to be chewed heavily, which will help you reach an earlier feeling of satiety. And that's exactly what's good for getting rid of excess abdominal fat. In addition, the fibers in the stomach and intestines absorb water, which increases the volume of the food and also increases the feeling of satiety. On top of that, fiber also has little calories. It only contains about 2 calories per gram. And once again, a calorie deficit is the most crucial thing if you want to lose weight. The German Nutrition Society therefore recommends consuming 30 grams of fiber every day. My tip is to eat as much as possible fiber for breakfast in the morning. Tip number 3, avoid sugar and snacks with a high fat content. So don't just leave out the sweet drinks, but also cakes, chocolate bars, chips, and so on. It is precisely these snacks that cause abdominal fat. So try replacing the chocolate bar or other sweets bit by bit with some fruit or vegetable snacks instead. Keyword healthy snacks. And yes, nuts are fatty, but they are also quite filling and very rich in protein. They are relatively high in calories. Yes, that's true, but they're also healthy. And the reason why this is the case is that they're high in omega-3 fatty acids, which help counterbalance the bad hormones that I mentioned earlier, these pro-inflammatory hormones from the abdominal fat. Hopefully, tip number 4 is no longer an insider tip. You should only ingest the right carbohydrates. Why is that? The more complex a carbohydrate is, or in other words, the more long chain a carbohydrate is, the longer it takes our body to break it down and bring the sugar molecules into the bloodstream. With simple carbohydrates, the sugar molecules enter the blood very quickly, causing the blood sugar level to rise quickly, but then to fall again just as quickly. That's not good. The result of this are the dreaded cravings. What do cravings lead to? They will lead to us eating donuts, to us eating sweets, and all of that goes onto the stomach, so to speak. Whole grain products, on the other hand, contain complex carbohydrates. They first have to be broken down by our stomach and digestions, and are therefore only gradually available to our body. This keeps our blood sugar curve flatter, the sugar levels stay relatively constant. My tip you should remember is to avoid everything that is available at the station kiosk. So simple rolls or buns, donuts, sweets, and all that. And tip number 5, exercise regularly several times a week. It is important to exercise frequently, but not for too long each time. The WHO recommends a moderate time of exercise of at least 150 minutes per week. I can recommend, for example, cycling, walking, swimming, something that you can do at a comfortable level of exertion. You should incorporate exercise into your everyday life. I also say this in my videos. Take the stairs instead of the elevator, cycle to work instead of driving, and much more. And that's how you are able to exercise despite your work and your family. That's ultimately an excuse. You can achieve it with alternative exercise. A fitness app could help if you find that difficult. A fitness watch that perhaps counts your steps and motivates you to move. Find what works for you. There are now many options for achieving daily step goals, for example. People say roughly 10,000 steps a day. That's a good number for a start. If you have any additional tips on how to effectively combat your fat, especially abdominal fat, please post them in the comments. Let's have a discussion about them. Thank you very much and stay with me.